Hello, I am Octavia Randolph, author of the historical fiction series, The Circle of Ceridwen Saga, and today I have the pleasure of a conversation with my fellow author, Theodore Brun. Theo is the creator of the Wanderer Chronicles, with the fourth novel, A Savage Moon, to be released October 2023. So congratulations, Theo, on expanding the series as you have.
Thank you very much, Octavia. It's lovely to see you again. I'm so glad the shoe is on the other foot.
Delighted to return the favor, Theo. Before we begin talking about the books, let's look at your path to writing them.
Sure.
You have a professional background in the factual world of the law, just about as far as possible from the world of imagination as one can get.
Yes, it is. It does feel a huge distance, but there are sort of threads and hints of what was to come, even when I was working in the law. So I worked for about 6 or 7 years in my legal career for 2 magic circle firms, but in a few different countries. So I worked in Moscow, I worked in Paris, and ended up in Hong Kong, in fact. And to give you some hint, I was doing contentious law, so international arbitration law. And the best bit for me was writing what we call witness statements, which is essentially the storytelling part of any case. And I was always, I was still quite junior at that time, and I would always get sent back my first draft to go with sort of critique saying, this is far too dramatic, far too colorful. We just need, like, every statement has to be backed up by a fact. So there was possibly hints of other things to come. But I mean, in terms of my creative background, I just had nothing. It was just flatline for 33 years or something like that, or it felt like that. And so, yeah, so it was very much a kind of a new birth, as it were, in the realm of imagination, as you said.
Yes, and I think not only the international exposure that your law career gave you, but as you said, you found that you were in fact using storytelling. And the other thing that strikes me about how the background serves you is that the concept of law, of the lawgiver, and the notion of moving beyond mere vendetta to actual justice not requiring bloodshed were very real issues in warrior culture 1,000 years ago. Obviously, more so in Christian cultures, which might be trying to pattern themselves more closely to an ideal of kingship, which allowed mercy. But that dynamic tension between strict revenge and vendetta, and allowing for the possibility of mercy, in other words, the law, is endlessly fascinating to the modern mind. It certainly is to mine, and I'm sure to you as well.
Yeah, that's interesting. I never actually thought of it like that, but you're right in that it's. I mean, to give you some inspiration, some of the inspiration for the whole series came even further back than my legal career, which was actually the Wagner's Ring Cycle, and it wasn't which I think it was the music that kind of got me into the material, if you like, of all that you're talking about, the Norse mythology, the material culture, which I had a little bit of background from my archaeology degree. But one of the things I remember from the storytelling part of Wagner's operas was that Odin, the god Odin, is recording his contracts, his agreements on his spear. Like he carves and he ties himself in such knots through these agreements that he's done, that he finds himself in a massive bind, and that's all part of the plot. So it's interesting. Yeah, it's funny when you start talking about contract and law in order to prevent things. Also, it can causes many problems as solve them, I suppose. Yeah. But yes, interesting, the idea of, like, yes, we can step away from those endless blood feuds, perhaps, because this is a system now in place.
Because it's such an important part. The concept of vendetta and revenge was something that was so dominant. And then when you start to bring law into it, when you start to bring the concept of mercy into it, you're taking it to a whole new level. I'm also deeply interested in the fact that was yet another art form, music, which was an introduction to you. And it leads me to ask what I know many of our audience would love to hear. What are these books about, the Wanderer Chronicles, and why did you write them?
Well, the books, I've thought about the question of theme since our conversation. You've made me think quite deeply, and I think at the root of these things was a kind of worldview that is wrestling with: is it power or is it love? Like, who wins out between, what wins out between power and love? And you can fit a lot of worldviews into. There is we're talking about justice and vendettas. There is ultimately no justice. It's just about who has the power to kind of, and to control things. Or is there a kind of deeper ethic of self-sacrifice? And I mean, you can call it love, but that's a sort of catch-all terms for things like justice and self-sacrifice and goodness in a way. And so the story is really my exploration of that theme. It begins. I was always interested in fact the seed for the whole idea came from a lecture about a Christian monk who appears in this latest book, finally in the fourth book, and it was to do with him, the conflict between Christianity and paganism, and him chopping down this sacred oak of Thor in this dark German forest. And I thought it introduced me into this fault line of Christianity, different worldviews, and then when I dug into the history at that time, a little bit of Islam as well, and so I was looking for a character to explore this world where I thought there was a lot going on. And perhaps because of my own background as a half Dane, some background interest in the Norse world, Norse mythology, this kind of figure appeared in my head, who was this warrior who begins life in northern Jutland. And I suppose the first book, A Mighty Dawn, is really his coming of age story. Like, who is this guy? How does he end up becoming the eponymous warrior of my chronicles? And why does he leave his homeland? What's he sort of aiming at? And I think a lot of the ideas of this conflict between love and power are already woven into that when we launch into his story.
So it's very much built around this one chief protagonist, but he's also has a personal injury, a flaw, which I think lends a depth and a nuance to his character as well.
Yes, and that actually came after I'd already started conceiving of him as a character. And I think I was very conscious, again, possibly trickling in the back of my mind, as this hero figure in the Wagner stuff, or it's actually in the Old Norse, the Saga of the Volsung, is Siegfried, and how he's sort of ends up being quite one-dimensional. He's a strong warrior who will defeat anyone who comes against him. And I thought that sort of, there's not a lot of nuance in there. And so the idea of this guy who has a kind of chronic injury to his ankle, so he's limping everywhere. Psychologically, what does that do to a character? It started becoming a much richer individual in terms of examining not only the internal conflicts, but also the physical sort of deficiencies, if you like, or difficulties, that limitations that he would have in trying to be a great warrior in his age and having to fight often. And there is a line actually in the first book that, because it's his father that has caused this wound as well, which actually comes from a real life story I heard in a contemporary story. So I sort of appropriated that for this book. And his father sort of almost dares him to jump off this rock when he's a kid, and at the last minute he moves out of the way and he ends up hitting a rock underneath the sand on this beach, so he cripples himself. And his father says, well, look, if you can't, if he can no longer, if you can't run, you have to learn how to stand and fight. And he had learned how to stand and fight better than most men. So that gives you a flavor of who this guy has to be. He has to sort of fill his shoes in a different way than the conventional, yes, he learns how to fight and he's a great warrior, which is there as I suppose a trope of this kind of a story, but hopefully with a bit of an edge to it.
Well, most warriors who do not understand how to pick their battles rarely live long. And one of the attributes of your protagonist is that he is living quite a successful life in many ways, and much longer than many of his peers. So I know the Danish background heritage that you have, and you know, why did you write them? Obviously, this story is very much in your own blood because of your heritage, so you're feeling that as well. But why do you feel you were called? There's such an enormous selection of not only individual episodes that you could have highlighted, but the way that your characters travel, where they go, and what they're seeking for. What called you, do you think, to write this particular story? What was it that so entranced you to want to, you know, tell this story, and now over 4 volumes?
Yeah, I think it was, I always saw it as cyclical, in that he has to go away and come back again, and that almost what he is looking for is this a sort of absolution. I won't give away the plot, but in the first part of the first book, you know, something pretty terrible happens that shatters his family and shatters his relationship with his father. And so he kind of has to go into exile, and he's looking quite specifically at the end of the second book. It almost becomes a specific, an explicit goal for a lord and a love. And it's like he's always attaching himself for to someone else's schemes, to someone else's purpose, like these great lords. And I think he gets as far afield as Constantinople in the third book. So he ends up serving the emperor, the Byzantine emperor, or Roman emperor, I guess is technically what he was, in this great siege of Constantinople. And I think it's at the beginning of this fourth book, A Savage Moon, that he's quite, he's a broken man in the sense that he's exhausted from what he's been through. He's overcoming an illness, and I think there's a hint of sort of PTSD, like he's been through a lot. He just needs to rest. But and this is where the female character Lilla comes in as this other sort of energy, if you like, to drive him into the answer. What he really needs is not to be serving some other lord. He needs to understand his own sense of leadership. And I think it's taken all these struggles and trials for him to understand the man that he needs to be. He needs to sort of step up a level in order to lead men, and then kind of realize the real person, the true yes. leader that he is inside.
And also, I feel, to meet his match in the sense that to be with a woman who's so dynamic as she is, and someone who's truly his equal strategically and in courage. And I think that meant an enormous amount to the development, the story development, and to his development in Savage Moon. So
yeah, 100%. I think, I mean, maybe it's a reflection in part of my own story. All these things are, I think, ultimately, and the characters come out of sort of hidden places in your own psyche, don't they? But the idea of the beauty, if you like, the in a way, the idolatry, if I can call it that, of beauty, like the over inflation of the romantic in his head has got him into all this trouble at the beginning of his whole saga. And Lilla, for me, represents, I mean, she is a bit of an ideal. She's a heroine figure. She's very capable and smart and all the things you've just described. But at the same time, she's not a dream figure. He's dealing with her as she really is. And I think that is, he's kind of left behind this idea, this slightly youthful idea of highfalutin romance. And it's like, I'm going to engage with her as an adult. And because he's still a young man, you know, he's 21, 22. So in some sense, you know, my own experience of, you know, having and failing relationships, and now finding my own wife, you know, a relationship that you're meeting as equals is probably reflected in one's fiction as well, you know. And if you really want to say, why did he write this book, go right back to the beginning of the first one. You know, the broken romance at the time I was writing was almost an act of catharsis for me in writing this book, as something that had ultimately in my legal career had driven me out to Hong Kong, was this broken engagement, and it was all very painful. And it was like, you know, that maybe it was that fracturing that opened up something into which the imagination could then pour in, and things start coming together in terms of ideas. And sort of retroactively, to answer your question, why did I have to write this book? I had to honor the ideas that were coming together in my head. And I suppose as that happened, I'd always had enormous respect for authors and loved literature, but I'd never seen myself in that guise. So it was kind of these things stirring in me that needed to come out somehow, and this is the story in which they've had. So hopefully there's some maturation, if I can call it that, in this fourth book. But that relationship between Lilla and Erlan, I feel like, gets real. You know, it's not smooth sailing between them, and there's doubts and there's troubles and arguments, and yet at the same time there's a sort of mutual respect and a mutual sense that, like, together they could be strong, they can strengthen one another when they're running well together. And hopefully that's kind of the note that they move on into the following book with.
I think that's beautifully expressed. Thank you, and powerfully expressed. I'd like to turn to a question which I think is really important for readers of historical fiction, and that is historic veracity. So what is your thinking on historic veracity and historical fiction? And I want to stress that this is a question apart from the use of magical realism in your work. Magic and faith in God was in part it was part of the belief system of the era. So as far as I'm concerned, these are not fantasy aspects. Magic was real, and the gods were real to these characters. So given that, what is your responsibility, if any, to your reader in presenting the era?
Well, I will let you into a secret, which is right from the beginning, people had started describe, you know, professionals describe it as sort of historical fantasy because there's supernatural elements to it. I just think of it as the reality that they're dealing with. I think there's a lot of strange things. I've seen a lot of strange things, inexplicable things in my lifetime, I'm sure. And in a sense, our own life is mediated by technology to such an extent that loss of connection through not like nature. I'm not sort of a nature worshiper. Obviously, I have great love for nature, but there's something about we think that we see things very clearly and very true, but there's something arrogant in that. And actually, to jump back to you know, whatever we're talking, 1200, 1300 years, they see things in a different way. And as an author, of course, you've got to try and get into their heads to try and close that gap, so you can try and see things more as they would have see it. So hopefully that comes through in these books. But to speak to the idea of actual historical fact, so far as we know it for this period, which is relatively scant and as historical periods go, I feel I don't feel, put it like this, I don't feel myself bolted down to absolutely everything that I can discover about this period. So I try to introduce actual historical characters, often as kind of what do you call them, secondary characters or foils to my two fictional protagonists. You know, for example, the siege of Constantinople was factually, as everything that I knew happened connected with that siege was in the book. So whether it was exactly as I described, who knows. In this book, we've got, I think, at least 3, if not 4 actual historical characters, and I've done the research to understand them as closely as possible, but there's quite a bit of gaps in terms of their narrative. So I mean, there's one character who is into history. He's known as Charles Martel, who was the grandfather of Charlemagne, based in Francia. I never know how to pronounce it, Francia or Francia, what's now more or less France and a bit of Germany. And the early stages of his career, the opening of his career, it's a bit murky what was going on, but I tried to be historically true to that which is known about the battles that happen and his rivals who were trying to stop him ascending to power, and how he kind of finally broke through, as it were. So I think it's a bit of both. It's a bit of both. Our period has lots of gaps in it, and so therefore enables us to use our imaginations to fill it. But I have enjoyed getting closer to those individuals who are historically true. How well I've done that, I don't know. I suppose it's in a sense, we'll never know, because one has to start with a template and then flesh it out into something 3D. But I've given it a good go.
It's an armature on which you are hanging the story. I mean, we can take what is received history and then build around that armature. And I think therein is the difficulty, and therein is the great reward. I mean, there's great opportunity in that. And I'd like you to speak a little bit about that, you know, the challenging aspects about writing about a period where certain records are all on essentially one side, the Christian side typically, and how you dealt with those challenges, and where you found the rewards in choosing this time period, just because of the same paucity and freedom that having so little to go on sometimes gave you.
Well, the challenges in some ways are outweighed by the advantages, I would say. You know, my imagination's pretty active in terms of filling the spaces. But you know, in a sense, there was a challenge with this particular book, because I knew I was taking these guys home from Constantinople. They have to, in order to resolve the entire cycle of the stories, they have to go back to the north, but I couldn't see a way of doing it in one book. So I thought, well, I already started seeing this story based in Francia, and therefore what's going on there historically, there's a lot to do with the Merovingian dynasty on the way out, the Carolingian dynasty in the ascendance. But which bit of it do I pick? and how much do I try and put in? And I became very, very confused in terms of a sort of innate desire to couch my story somewhat in that world, but knowing how to make it all hang together. And I had these two characters of Winfrid of Nursling, this Christian missionary who sort of started the whole imaginative process back in 2009. So I kind of wanted him in there, and I also wanted Charles Martel. And eventually, I remember at the moment I was standing in a bookshop somewhere in the north here in England, and I was trying to wrestle this thing, and I was like, oh, it's a journey into a heart of darkness. This is sort of it's a bit Joseph Conrad. And although and that kind of helped me start framing, like, how does that work with the characters I've got, and it actually enabled me to pick the moments in the actual history that were going to work and how to thread those together. So almost like the fictional through line enables you to make sense of what historical facts you're going to use and not use, and where you're going to go within the historical record such as it exists. I hope that begins to answer some.
It's very complete, and actually quite a good lead into my next query, which is, how do your characters actually emerge for you? Do they typically respond to a plot device, for instance, and thus arise to fill a need? Or do they manifest, and as you get to know them, you understand where they fit in?
I think they manifest. If I was to pick one, yes, but having manifested, some of them I think it's continuation really on that theme. It's not so much, oh, I need someone. There have been a couple of characters who've appeared as a necessity of a plot point I want to get through, and it's interesting that they tend to get to a point where I'm like, I don't need this guy, and I drop him out or drop her out. And I've done that on the last two books. I had this great shield maiden character who may come back when we end up back in Scandinavia, but she was there as sort of part of the gang, as it were, in the third book. And I realized she just didn't have enough to do and she didn't need to be there. So I was like, okay, she's a great character, but I will leave her for another story. And similarly, one of those in this book, A Savage Moon. But what's interesting is, I know you were fond of the Gotlander character, Ran, who's one of Erland and Lilla's sort of misfit crew. They hardly make up a crew, to be honest. And it was interesting how within, I sit down and think, okay, right, I've got to have a crew of people, few different types of characters in there. But within that, as you write the story, some of them very much step forward into their fullness, and others, just don't pick up. And I think that's what you're describing, that sense of manifesting. A character just comes to life, and you think, I want to spend more time. I want him or her more in the picture, and like, what's she thinking and what's she going to do next? So hope that answers your question.
It does indeed. As we move towards our closing here, what do you hope that readers carry away with them after embarking on this journey with you? Obviously, they're ripping good yarns, and the entertainment value is certainly there. But what are you really hoping that readers will be thinking about in the weeks after they finish the books?
Gosh, that is a good question, isn't it? I mean, I think there was examinations of what it is to be a man, and also a woman. I mean, not to arrogate myself into really understanding what that is, but I thought it was interesting with the character of Lilla. One of the things I was conscious of was this sort of journey, if I could trace a line, it was sort of journey towards a more warrior-like spirit and masculine spirit. And then at the end of the story, something a bit more of the mother comes into her, and a bit, she has incredible hardness of heart at moments in the middle periods of the book that then soften into something else. And she's still a very strong, purposeful woman, but there is that softness to her as well. And I think with Erland as well, of course, Sword's skills of like knocking people's heads off and all of that, but that's not really what this book is about. It's like, what's he journeying towards as a man? And like, is he going to be in this incredibly brutal, violent world? As to come back to your original point of vendetta and all the rest of it, it's like, is that going to turn him into a monster, or is it going to be the elevation of him into the most authentic version of himself that he can be? So there's hopefully some of those things are going on in people's minds, as well as, I'm very much a firm believer of, if you open my book at page 1, I want to grab you, basically steal your head for 500 pages and not let you go until I'm ready to let you go. So it's like a lot of these books. I think the immersion factor is important to me as well, and that they've just kind of come up for air at the end thinking, wow, okay, now I can breathe again.
I feel there's no more important question than you can pose to yourself, your characters, and your readers is, what is it to be a man? What is it to be a woman? What is it to be human? That's everything. That's the profundity of escaping into a book, is posing those questions.
Yeah, I mean, that is why we tell stories. In fact, all the way back to, as far as we can see in history, that is why anyone's ever told a story.
Hear, hear. So what is next, Theo, on your artistic horizon?
What is next? Well, I've got a number of things, not so many in the historical fiction front. I mean, I would love to write book 5. It may be a little time before I have the opportunities to do that. I do ghostwriting as well as my own fiction stuff. So I have a project to do with kids fantasy fiction, which I'm about to launch into, which could be really interesting.
That sounds fun.
Different world, but same sort of principles. And I do have a good idea brewing for a different period of history. It's more like a historical thriller, historical mystery, set in the 19th century. But there's a curveball. I may use that and then spin it into a dual timeline for a contemporary thing as well. So there's a few different things going on in my imagination, but I desperately do also want to complete the story of Lilla and Erland at some point in the not too distant future, because I can sort of see it all in my head.
Please
already
do.
And see where it lands. So
great. Well, thank you so much, Theo Brun, for this conversation. I'm just delighted that we could talk about the Wandering Chronicles, and again, A Savage Moon, which will be released October 2023.
That is wonderful. Thank you very much for your time, Octavia. It's been a pleasure.
It's been a joy for me.